Well, this is amazing. Clark and Mike from Johnny Hates Jazz. Hello.
Hello.
Both of you. This is
Yes.
incredible. I feel very special. We haven't had two guests in here since you and Cry did this, so welcome both of you. By the way, can I just say, Clark, congratulations. Remember that performance you did with Chris Evans? It was amazing. We had so many messages saying how amazing. Did you enjoy it?
Very much so. It's interesting. Shattered Dreams is a song that translates into an acoustic form very, very easily. And that, in some ways, that makes sense because I wrote it on a piano in my parents' front room, a little upright piano. And back then, the way we wrote songs was that you finished the song first and then you recorded it if it was good enough. There was no kind of writing as you went along in the studio. So it's kind of a natural environment for it to be in, on piano and Mike on bass and our mate Nick on guitar. But I have to say Chris is great as well. I mean, he's so lovely and positive energy, so that helps as well.
It really was the perfect morning. And just to go on to talk about Shattered Dreams, it is the first song this week on My Ages Plays. Of course it is. Tell me what you were saying a moment ago to me, Mike, about, because I think, and I'm going to fanboy over you now, but I think it's the perfect pop song.
It's certainly from my point of view. When we made records, I was telling Chris when we did the interview with him, we made the records ourselves. We were the only ones in the studio, which is not normal. Most bands will have a producer, they'll have an engineer, they'll have people operating. That was us. So everything on that record is just us, and I'm personally the most proud of that record. It's a great little pop record. Not everyone's cup of tea, but it has its own unique little sound. And
do you know what I love about it though? Because when I'm happy, it makes me happier. When I feel melancholic, it suits that mood. It's got a number of moods in one record, and it's clever. They don't make many records like that, Clark.
I think that's interestingly, we were talking about this last night. It's the idea of writing a song which is fairly upbeat, but with a lyric which is quite melancholy, and that's something that I never really thought of doing. It just seems to happen quite naturally. Maybe it's something to do with the music that we grew up listening to. And so in that sense, you can listen to it on one level, and it's a powerful track, Shattered Dreams. It's got great energy. And then you can listen to it in a very different environment, and it's very introspective. It's interesting.
Brilliant. Who wants to talk about David Bowie, This Is Not America? Clark?
Please, yeah. David Bowie and Pat Metheny, This Is Not America, is one of my favourite tracks from that era. Mm-hmm. And I think what's amazing about it is that there were quite a few artists who arose in the 60s or 70s who transformed their sound into the 80s and had enormous hits with great records. And Bowie was one of them, obviously. But I think This Is Not America is one that is sometimes overlooked when you think about Let's Dance and that kind of thing. And in actual fact, it influenced me in how I wrote to a degree, because if you listen to This Is Not America, it's got what we call a synth pad going through it. And that's basically something that sounds like an orchestra, but it's a synthesizer. And you'll hear it going all the way through. It's very beautiful, very evocative. And that became something that was important for me when I was putting our little songwriting demos together. I always had that element in there. So there were technical reasons why I loved This Is Not America as well, but it's such a touching song, and what a brilliant vocal by Bowie. I mean, one of the greatest singers, let alone songwriters.
Yeah, and as we go into this, so let me just ask you a quick question. Were you always into music? Did you always know that this is what you wanted to do?
Absolutely. My dad was a professional jazz musician. He was in a couple of very big bands in the 50s. The Stargazers were the first British band to have a -- hit on the UK chart.
Wow.
So, and he also sang on I Am the Walrus. He sang with Ella Fitzgerald, Sinatra. So it was kind of, you could say, in my blood, but you've still got to make an effort. It's not. There was still a lot of hard graft. Yeah, exactly. You still got to turn up. Yeah.
Mike, come on, a song from you, please, on My 80s playlist. What do you fancy?
We were asked to 80s. This one technically, I think, came out in '79.
It's perfect.
It's What a Fool Believes by the Doobie Brothers.
Right.
It's that record. It means so much to me. Well, when it first came out, of course, I was an enormous fan of it. But then over the years, when I started working in the studio, you realize just how difficult making records is. Well, I sometimes call it's a war of attrition. Certainly back in the day when we were making records.
How do you mean? Why is it so difficult?
Because everything that's on the record you have to perform to be on the record. So to get a certain feeling, a certain vibe, you had to do it. These days it's different. Now it's all on the computer.
Right.
So you don't like that sound? We'll try this one.
Yeah.
In those days, if you wanted it to sound a certain way, or even if you wanted it to sound a way you couldn't envisage, you had to create the sound.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of these records that was magical. And just a few years ago, I read this interview, I think it was with Michael McDonald, about the making of that record. And as I was reading this interview, I was internally punching the air, because here was this magical record to me, and they had the same problems that we had.
Really?
I thought it was just the Doobie Brothers, Ted Templeman, Michael McDonald, they just went in the studio in an afternoon and made this record. No. It was an incredible struggle, but luckily for them, the producer in this article, the producer knew this song was magical. He didn't know quite how to make it magical, so they just worked at it, and then they came up with what I think is one of the great records from that era.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. You guys, I just wanted to talk about this because you're back on tour, big time, aren't you, this year?
We are.
Clark, tell me about the dates where we can catch you. Can I come as well? I really want to come.
Of course you can.
Gigs.
You can come to every single one if you
I'll
want.
be at the front lip syncing Shattered Dreams.
Yeah, well, we're touring all over the country this year, and it's actually our very first headline tour.
Right.
Which sounds a bit strange when you consider how long we've been together. As Johnny Hates Jazz, we formed in '86. But we split up, in '88, didn't speak to each other for 20 years, odd, then got back together. So we're kind of, in a way, playing catch-up. And so we're playing all over the country, and we're finishing up in December at the Indigo at the O2.
Amazing.
December 19th. That's going to be a very special gig. We're going to have a few guests come and join us. And, we're really looking forward to it. We've done a lot of live playing over the years. But we supported Level 42 a couple of years ago, but we've never done our own thing, so this is going to be really good.
And how excited are you about this?
Oh, very much so, because also a big part of it is the audience reaction, and they're so appreciative. People who come to see us live always make a point of coming up to us afterwards and wanting to tell their stories of what the songs meant for them, and also the newer songs as well. So it really works.
Mike, let's step into another song on the list. Crowded House, what a band.
What a band. And this was a record that was there at the time. I was working in the studio, and I have a very basic thing when it comes to music. If I like the tune, I like it, and I just love this tune. And that's a great record too, but it's just one of those records from that time that has lasted. It still sounds great, and yeah.
And what is it as a muser? I've got to ask you, because you could say the same with you.
Yeah.
How do you make a record that just doesn't date?
Well, here's the thing. Sometimes it just happens. I'm, of course, because of my background, I think a lot of people, they'll often say, "Oh, have you heard that? I love that song." But I think what they really mean is, I love that record, because there's a difference. So,
what's that? What is the difference?
Well, if you here's an example. You'll have an artist, and you'll hear a song, and you'll go, "I love that one," and then you'll find out that song was actually, there's an original. It's a cover, but the first time you heard that song was this person's. And when you hear the original, you go, "Oh, I prefer the cover."
Yeah.
So that happens quite often.
Gotcha.
So it's the performance, the magic of the record.
Do you know Neil Finn? I mean, what a CV he's got, from Crowded House to Fleetwood Mac.
We've never met, exactly. Yeah, it's just.
We were actually, I remember us doing an interview in, I think it was Germany, somewhere in mainland Europe, and we were in all these little, it was Italy, we were in all these little pods doing our own interviews, and they were glass pods, so you could see all the other artists doing their interviews, and Crowded House suddenly burst into Don't Dream It's Over a cappella, without any instruments even.
Wow.
And it sounded absolutely beautiful. I remember just being really overawed. Yeah.
Amazing. It's incredible meeting you guys, and all this week you're picking the songs that mean the most to you. And Clark, spotlight's back on you. What do you fancy?
Well, let's talk
today?
about Silent Running by Mike and the Mechanics. And I really, really love this record. I've always loved Genesis. Mike's a big Genesis fan from back in the day.
First gig I ever went to was the original Genesis with Peter Gabriel.
No way.
Yes.
Wow. So you saw the original.
The original, that's the first big proper gig I went to, so you can imagine how inspiring it was.
Huge, yeah. And so Silent Running came out. I loved it. I loved the fact that the subject matter, and this is especially relevant when you see the video, is about a nuclear attack and how the public responds to it. It's pretty heavy, actually. Again, it's an interesting concept of a fairly up-tempo track, but it's got a heavy meaning behind it. And we met Mike Rutherford on the road now and again, and he was always an absolute gent. It was always lovely to see him. Yeah, he was great. And then it didn't see him for many years. Then after Mike and I reformed Johnny Hates Jazz, a mutual friend of ours suggested that I have a go at writing with Mike Rutherford for a future Mike and the Mechanics album, which I did. And he was so generous, such a lovely fella. And he's someone that I found, just to be around him, he's not someone who talks much about, you know, his history or will regale you with stories minute after minute. You have to really prize them out of him, because he's very humble. But I think that there was an amazing sense of coming full circle, that I absolutely loved Silent Running and other Mike and the Mechanics tracks. And then there I was working with him day after day on this Mike and Mechanics album. And actually, in fact, I saw him recently, and I think we're going to do more in the coming months. Yes,
that's exciting.
Yeah.
Will he be there at the shows this year?
I'll make sure he is, whether he wants to or not.
Can we talk, and Life's What You Make It? Whose track is that? Is that yours?
Yeah,
Clark?
You like that one as well.
I do, yeah.
I think this is an amazing song. This is so emotional for me, and you tell me why you like this.
Well, firstly, Life's What You Make It is another one of those songs, a bit like Don't Dream It's Over, that has, you know, stood the test of time and will continue to. But the production approach of Life's What You Make It is very different to the Crowded House track. And yet they've got this sense of freshness about they could have been made yesterday. Not that they sound like something from today. They sound absolutely timeless.
Yeah.
I love the video to Life's What You Make It. It's the guys are in a forest and there's lots of wild animals at night.
Yes.
Kind of appearing here and there. It's very, very vibey, and it's just a brilliant song. You think about the fact that the bass line is pretty much carried by a piano, dun, and that's kind of the basis of the song.
Yeah.
It's a very, very powerful record. I love it.
And it pretty much stays, I mean, I'm not a musician, but it stays in the same kind of tempo throughout the whole song, doesn't it? It doesn't go up and down, it doesn't slow.
It does, and that's hard to do with a song which is actually pretty slow, but it's still got intense power, and that's of course Mark, the late Mark Hollis, and what a profound performer and singer he was. So yeah, it's a tremendous record.
Got a quick question for you. You mentioned earlier that you kind of split. Was it in '88?
Yes.
Can I ask what happened there and why it took so long to get back? I'm always good at these uncomfortable questions.
I think that, this has been asked to me because I was the one that walked away many times, and it was a very inopportune moment. I mean, we just had a number 2 hit in the US, and the world was our lobster, really. But I think I was very affected. Actually, we nearly talked about this with Chris, and we didn't have time to get into it. I was very affected by some of the criticism we received in the UK. And in the rest of the world, we didn't have that criticism. In the UK, 99% of the time, we had a very positive reaction.
Yeah.
But there were some quarters of the music journalist world that were quite unkind to us. And I took that very personally.
What did they say?
Well, do you know what? I don't... It's not even worth remembering. It's just that it was unnecessary, and I was fairly young, and I thought I was prepared for all that kind of thing, but it affected me much more, and I was unhappy with the way that our record label at the time were selling us, basically, and that was nothing to do with Mike and our previous colleague Calvin. It was more of a kind of a promotional issue, and so much so that I decided to jump ship. I thought that I thought this was going to be something that was hard to salvage. Looking back, that was a stupid thing to do in a way. As much as I celebrate my life since then, and I certainly do in my experiences, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
Yeah.
But really, what you got to do at that time, especially if you're in a band, is you got to pull together and find a way through it, because everyone's experiencing a similar thing from their own perspective.
In a way, Chris, in the interview we did with Chris, he touched on this subject. We were a little bit different than all the other bands. We were not a cliquey with all the other bands chatting away. We were kind of separate from them.
Yeah.
So we didn't like it when we were a boy band. We were never a boy band. We weren't put together by some Svengali something. So when we were associated and put into that bracket, and by some of these journalists, it was kind of like, well, no, that's not us.
So they couldn't pigeonhole you,
Yes.
and that made them feel awkward about the
Yes,
whole. Yeah,
and they'd say,
it's
oh,
interesting.
they're naff or they're whatever, so it's kind of...
Which is so unfair, because that's the last thing I would call you guys. You're real musicians. You know your trade.
Tell the story about Italy, Mike.
The first TV show we did, a foreign TV show, was in Italy. So we flew there. This was while Shattered Dreams was out. Flew to Italy. We sit down with a journalist, an Italian journalist, and he says, so, Johnny H. Jazz, the pop Steely Dan. Now, to Clark and I, where it was like, wow, you get it.
That was
Look,
it.
I'm not comparing us with Steely Dan. Forget it. Steely Dan are just the masters of everything. But there are elements that we try to incorporate. So this Italian journalist saw us in a completely different light than the British ones.
That's amazing, isn't it? Well, let's go into Turn Back the Clock, shall we? Should we play that?
Yeah, go for it.
And tell me about this song, because obviously the first song most people talk about is Shattered Dreams, but this is huge. And I always think of you guys when when this song pops up. I think about where I was. You've soundtracked so many people's lives. Tell me about this song.
Well, both Mike and I were avid readers of Stephen King back in the day, and he had written a short story called The Body, which is in a novella called Different Seasons, and The Body was turned into a film called Stand By Me, and that story inspired me to imagine how I would feel about myself, my past, when I'm older. In other words, I was trying to place myself now. Here I am at the age of 59 going on 60. But
you look amazing, by the way.
Thank you. That's very kind. You read your lines well there. Thank you very much. But I was 22 when I wrote it, and I had no idea of really if I was going to feel that way about my life. And I think for many years I didn't think I would. I was kind of slightly detached from the song. And then the older I've become, and the more we've performed it for people, and people respond so warmly to that one. The more meaningful it's become to me. So it's now a very touching record. The other thing I love about Turn Back the Clock is that we had Kim Wilde on backing vocals on that one, and that's all. Her voice adds this subliminal magic, which is very, very hard to replicate. I know Kim's totally unique in that way.
What was that like, meeting Kim?
Well, we knew Kim very well. She was the studio we worked in. Kim was part of the label, and she was always there. So I've worked with Kim many times before that. So it was kind of just asking a friend to sing on the record.
Yeah.
So,
and is there any opportunity, I'm going to ask both of you here, that Kim might jump back on stage in one of the gigs this year?
We can't say.
I have no idea.
But there will be special guests, or there could be.
Well, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope so.
You can't see me. I've got everything crossed over here. Lovely stuff. Let's talk. We've got Johnny Hates Jazz doing my 80s playlist. Shaka Khan, Mike.
One of the reasons I picked this was because I remember the first time I heard it was on Radio 1, and came on, and obviously the system was, and it was just wow. This is just an amazing record. Just
what is it about this record?
Well, it's just the performance, just the tune. So, but what I remember most of all, bizarrely enough, is when it faded out, I was thinking that was an amazing record. And the Radio 1 DJ, and I'm not going to say the name, said, "Oh, that's a bit disappointing," because it was whatever the record before had been, and I was thinking, what?
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Do you know, I've been doing radio for like 26 years. I've worked in all different formats, all different stations. This is the one song that I've played on every single. It doesn't matter because
because it's an amazing record,
isn't
isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you agree with that?
Very much so. Actually, interestingly, after I left Johnny Hates Jazz in '88, I did some solo stuff, and I worked with a guy called John Robinson, J.R. Robinson, who was the drummer on that record. The drummer from Rufus.
Oh, really?
Shaka Khan's band Rufus. Yeah.
What did he say about it?
Oh, he played it for me there and then, because he introduced himself. Lovely fella. He introduced himself as the human drum machine, which makes him sound very robotic. He's not at all, but he is a phenomenal drummer.
One of the all-time great.
Absolutely.
Studio drummers, yeah.
So, and I think that's another thing about that record. Ain't Nobody has just such brilliant musicianship, let alone Shaka herself, and such an amazing voice. It's all that period of time of record making incorporated some people with serious abilities. You could not go into a studio back then, with a little portable keyboard and think you can get away with knowing 3 chords. You had to be practically a virtuoso.
Yeah, absolutely.
This goes back to the record, though. The record. We made a version of Turn Around the Clock. It was a 48 track. I mean, we spent a lot of time on it. Finished it, sat back and listened to it, and it was like, this record isn't as good as the song. So we redid it.
Yeah.
To the version that became well known. It's the record.
Brilliant. Mike, you're the bassist, is that right?
No, I play the bass when we play live, but I'm not the bassist. Funny enough, I try my best to play the bass that's on the record, and quite often it was Clark playing on a keyboard. So I'm trying to recreate what Clark did, and I only play those notes. We toured recently, a couple of years ago, with Level 42.
Yeah,
and so here I am going on before them, and it's like I'm thinking Mark King is following us, and half the audience are bass players because they've come to see Mark King, and I'm just a guy.
Pressure.
Exactly. I'm not a bass player, but I tried my best to play the right notes. So
I want to actually butt in there if I may, because
go on, Clark.
The thing is that Mike knows our music inside out. So when he plays, he feels it totally differently than anyone else. So I remember when he first played bass in rehearsals when we were going to do some live stuff. And I remember me and the other musicians in the room looked at each other and kind of nodded, because suddenly it felt different. It felt much more like the record.
Yeah.
So he's got that about him.
That's very kind.
Look at you, amazing. I'm glad I asked the question. What was that next song that we're going to play?
The next one is Boys of Summer,
Yes.
Don Henley. This is an interesting one because I was growing up, I'm American, you can hear my accent, so I liked West Coast music. The Eagles, again, we're back to the tunes. The Eagles just had amazing songs, amazing tunes. And so this was the first record that I personally liked of the solo bunch. And I remember reading, I think it was whether it was an interview or reading, Don Henley said, he'd been the drummer in the Eagles, and now all of a sudden he was the front guy, and all of a sudden he needed to be a performer. He was just the drummer.
Yeah.
So that was part of this. But it's a great tune. And I recently saw a little clip on how it came about. And it's a great little story. People should look it up.
Go on, tell me.
Well, Mike Campbell, I think who was the Tom Petty, the Heartbreakers, came up with the music.
Right.
Just in his studio using a Lynn drum.
Really?
And the guy in the next studio was Roger Lynn, who made it. So it was like the first time the Lynn drum had ever been used, which is a drum machine.
Yeah.
So he pitched it to Tom Petty. Tom Petty thought, it's not really for us. So he heard that Don Henley was looking for a song. So he got it to Don Henley, and Don Henley came up with this amazing tune on the back of the music.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
Pivotal song, isn't it? There's soundtrack, so many road trips and various moments in people's lives.
It's just, again, it's a great record.
Yeah, great stuff. It's been amazing this week. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Just to recap, you are performing live many gigs this year. I mean, just search them online. The big gig at the end of the year is the O2, isn't it?
Yeah, the Indigo O2 on December the 19th. And we actually kick off at Boysdale at the end of March 28th.
That's Canary Wharf.
That's Canary Wharf.
It's a warm-up, couple of warm-ups.
Really lovely.
Yeah.
Come along.
I'd love to.
28th and 29th. That's great fun. And then we head off around the country, and then we come back to the Indigo at the O2, December 19th, and that's going to be a lot of fun. That's going to be a lot of fun. We actually are toying with the idea of performing the whole of the Turn Back the Clock album at that gig.
Oh, really?
And we haven't done that before. That'll be the first time doing that live. Yeah.
And you know, the great thing is I can tell from both of you, we've been hanging out all this week. You seem, it's funny, life has a funny way, doesn't it, of working out, but it would seem that now is the right time for you guys to be back together, because you look like you're really fired up and really into it, you know, and looking forward to the gigs and sounding brilliant.
Yeah, I think so. There is something about the magic of timing. I'm a great believer in that, and I do feel that there's an openness towards us that there's always been that, but I think it's grown recently quite radically. So I think this is going to be a very, very interesting time this year and beyond.
So Clark, final song then this week. What's it to be?
It's going to be I Can't Go For That by Daryl Hall and John Oates. And an amazing thing about them is that it's another example of 70s survivors transforming what they do into the 80s and having a whole other career. I mean, you know, Mike and I grew up listening to Abandoned Luncheonette. You know, She's Gone is one of the great soul records of the age. But of course, they did evolve with, you know, Private Eyes and Kiss on My List and that kind of thing. The thing about I Can't Go For That, and I cannot stress this enough, when you think about the evolution of music and what happened in the 80s and the introduction of electronica in music as such a fundamental aspect of it, was that you can pick up a couple of records that were really important in that process. One of them would be Fade to Grey.
Yeah.
And I worked with Rusty Egan when I was a wee lad.
Amazing.
Yes, and that was a tremendous record. But the other, ironically, was Daryl Hall and John Oates, these guys from the 70s, soul dudes, who came up with I Can't Go For That, and that incredible drum machine that runs throughout it, and this very hypnotic bass line, which other people, shall we say, were inspired by
yes.
Later on, including Billie Jean, you know, the Michael Jackson track. It kicked off so much, but at the same time, it was a beautiful melody, beautiful vocals. It was almost the antithesis of where electronic music was going, which was becoming a little bit colder and still very powerful. Mm-hmm. But they kept the soulfulness of it, and I just was bowled over by that record.
I have an interesting story about this.
Go on, Mike.
I started when I was working in a recording studio as an engineer, and I was just the assistant. And at the time, I was the assistant. We were making an album with The Cure, Pornography. It's one of their legendary albums.
Yeah.
And so, when The Cure arrived, they were always The Cure. Robert Smith always looks like Robert Smith. He didn't come in tracksuit, but you know. So, funnily enough, I Can't Go For That was out at the time. So I remember sitting we had a little TV room up at the studio, and Top of the Pops, we would always go up and watch. So I was sitting there watching I Can't Go For That, looking at The Cure. It was just so wow.
Quite a moment.
It was, but it was so different. It's like that's why what Clark is saying, that they came from the 70s. They were these sort of, I don't know how old they were at the time, but they were these old guys.
Yeah.
So The Cure were like the current, and these old guys were having this hit, and it was very, very different sounding.
Amazing moment in time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
just before we finish, I've got one question I wanted to ask you guys about how did you handle the whole going on Top of the Pops, that kind of thing. How was that experience for you? Smash Hits magazine,
the Top of the Pops,
that came with it.
Top of the Pops was so important. I mean, you grow up watching it.
And how many million people watched that program every week? And it was their one chance to see what their favourite artists and bands looked like, wasn't it?
I mean, look, I think we have to be honest. There were moments when Top of the Pops was really naff, you know, because there were still some naff records around, and that's of course subjective, and I won't say what, but. So it's not like every episode was jam-packed with the best of what we now remember from that era. But it was so important in terms of reaching people, and it pretty much guaranteed you to go up the chart. It didn't always happen, but most of the time it did. So when we did our first Top of the Pops, there was a lot weighing on it. We were either going to go high or we were going to drop.
Right.
We were on a knife edge. And so I remember I was, you know, backstage, I was nervous as anything. And I think I was trying not to be, but
Didn't they keep you waiting all day until you
actually...
They do.
The whole day, yeah.
And the other thing is that at Top of the Pops back then, that's when you got to see your peers and the people you were actually competing with. So you'd walk down the corridor and Spandau would walk past you, or ABC or whatever it was. And you know what? it wasn't a pally situation. It was the 80s. We were hyper competitive with one another. So you'd shoot each other a side glance as you passed in the daggers, because you wanted to be as high as you could, and so that's how it was.
Yeah,
and it was a good one, Clark, because I think we were number 30. We did Top of the Pops, so we went to number 18.
Yeah,
so it was
just off the back of that. That's great. That was Shattered Dreams.
It was Shattered Dreams. Yeah,
amazing. Everyone should Google your performance. It's brilliant. It's great. I mean, it's just like, it's a great song, wonderful performance, and you gave it. I could tell.
I got to tell you, I've very quickly add a little story. We were all kind of gathered around a record producer called Mickey Most, very legendary record producer. He's responsible for people like the Animals, Donovan, Kim Wilde, Hot Chocolate, and Mike was an engineer at Mickey's studio. I was signed to Mickey as a singer-songwriter. And our former bandmate Calvin was Mickey's son, and a drummer in his own right, keyboard player as well. And when we did Shattered Dreams on Top of the Pops, I remember coming off stage thinking, oh man, I blew that. I was so nervous. I didn't do anything wrong, but I didn't think I was as good as I should have been. And Mickey came up to me the next day, and he said his wife, Chris, had said to him that it was such an impressive performance because you kind of wanted to cuddle Clark. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is getting worse. And then the next time we were on Top of the Pops, we did I Don't Want to Be a Hero, and I was much more confident. And I came off stage thinking, yeah, I can do this now, And the next day, saw Mickey, and he didn't say hello. We just walked into Rack Studios, and he came up to me. He said, "You lost it." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, you're not going to do that again, are you? You're too cocky now, aren't you?"
You can't win.
You can't win.
Listen, really lovely to spend time with you. Thank you so much. I can't wait to see the show.
Great.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for the performance with Chris as well. And great to meet both of you. Johnny Hates Jazz.
And you.
Incredible.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.